There comes a moment in life, when the laughter fades, when the phone stops ringing, and when the quiet of your home, once comforting, begins to echo like a warning, you're older now. The world outside moves faster than your legs can carry you, your children are busy. Your spouse may be long gone, and slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to disappear from your own life. One morning, you catch your reflection in the mirror, not the same fire in your eyes, not the same strength in your stance, and a thought whispers, maybe I can't do this alone anymore. That's when someone mentions it, maybe it's time you consider a nursing home. They say it gently, kindly, like it's a solution, a safe haven. You nod. Not because you want to, but because. What choice do you have? This is how it begins for many, not with a crash, but a quiet surrender, like Mr. Harold Green, 74 years old, widowed, retired carpenter, lived in the same small house for nearly 4 decades. His hands still smelled faintly of pine and old varnish, but his knees, well, they couldn't carry him up the stairs anymore. One night, after slipping in the bathtub, his daughter insisted, "Dad, it's time." He didn't fight, he packed a single suitcase, one photo of his late wife, and stepped into a facility with bright white walls, the smell of antiseptic, and a smiling receptionist who said, "Welcome, Mr. Green. We're so glad you're here." But he wasn't glad, not at all. What no one tells you is this: the first night in a nursing home doesn't feel like a beginning, it feels like a funeral without a casket, the end of freedom, the end of control, the end of being you. There's a schedule now, a buzzer for breakfast, a nurse for your pills, someone knocks before they enter, but you still feel watched, surveyed, managed. You're not in your home anymore, you're on someone else's time, and deep down, you start to wonder if you've made a mistake, but it's too late, you've already given up your keys. Aging is not the tragedy, loneliness is, not the kind where you're alone in a room, but the kind where your voice is no longer heard, where your opinions are no longer asked, where your soul no longer feels seen. This isn't about attacking nursing homes, it's about opening your eyes before you sign your life away, because what many don't realize is that the danger is not always physical, it's spiritual, it's emotional, it's the slow erosion of your identity under the gentle pressure of good intentions. Before you arrived, you were someone, maybe a teacher, maybe a soldier, maybe a mother who raised 4 children on a single income, maybe a man who built houses with his bare hands, who never missed Sunday dinner. You had a story, a voice, a name that meant something. But in the quiet corridors of a nursing home, that identity begins to fade. Eleanor James was 82 when she moved in, former nurse, quilter, grandmother of 7, her hands once comforted 100 babies into this world, but here, she became room 12B. 12B needs assistance. 12B missed lunch. 12B isn't responding. No one asked about her quilting, no one mentioned the garden she once kept so wild and alive it looked like it could breathe. No one called her by the name her late husband whispered for 50 years, Ellie. This is how it begins, the slow unraveling of your personhood, because in these places, efficiency matters more than individuality. There's a routine, a system, a structure designed for order, but it comes at a hidden cost. Your schedule is no longer yours. You eat when they tell you, you sleep when they decide, you shower on Tuesdays and Saturdays, whether you feel like it or not. You may be alive, but are you living? Some caregivers are kind, some genuinely care, but even the kindest system, if it sees you as just another resident, will slowly erase what makes you you. You stop choosing your clothes, your favorite mug is replaced with a plastic cup, the scent of your home, jasmine, old books, cinnamon, gone, replaced with bleach, starch, and cafeteria meals. And the worst part, you forget to speak up, to ask for more, to insist, I matter. Because in a place that treats everyone the same, you begin to believe you're not special anymore. But here's the truth, you are not your wheelchair, you are not your medication list, you are not the diagnosis on your chart, you are a story still being written, you are the punchline to 1,000 inside jokes. You are someone's everything, whether they visit or not, and the moment a system forgets that, it commits the worst sin of all. It makes you invisible. Imagine crying out for help, and no one comes. Imagine sitting in soiled clothes for hours, because there simply wasn't enough staff to change you. Imagine missing your medication, not because someone forgot, but because they were taking care of 10 others at the same time. This isn't fiction. This is reality in thousands of nursing homes across the country, a quiet crisis. Hiding in plain sight, meet Robert, 89 years old, Korean War veteran, had a laugh that could shake a room, and a deep love for crossword puzzles and Sinatra records. After a mild stroke, his family placed him in a well-reviewed facility, clean hallways, smiling brochures, promises of round-the-clock care. But inside, the truth was different. Robert would wait, sometimes 45 minutes, for someone to help him to the bathroom. He'd press the call button, then wait, and wait, until the urge passed, or worse, didn't. He wasn't ignored because no one cared, he was ignored because there were too few hands, and too many needs. Here's the hard truth, most nursing homes are severely understaffed. On paper, they meet the minimum. But in practice, one nurse aide for 12, sometimes 15 residents. One overworked nurse juggling medications, wound care, falls, and paperwork, with no time for small talk or dignity. What does this mean for the elderly? It means missed meals, it means skipped baths. It means wounds that don't get cleaned, and spirits that don't get lifted, because when a person is overworked, even with the best heart, they stop seeing people and start seeing tasks. You can't measure dignity with a stopwatch, you can't schedule a soul. An elder's need is not just physical, it's emotional, spiritual, deeply human, but when the system is stretched thin, kindness becomes a luxury, touch becomes rushed, and loneliness becomes chronic. What happens to the human spirit when it waits all day to be heard? What happens to a person's sense of self when every request feels like a burden? What happens to a mother who spent her life caring for others, now left in a wheelchair by the window, waiting for someone to notice? She's cold. Understaffing isn't just about slow service, it's about what happens when no one is looking, because in the shadows of neglect, sometimes something far worse begins to creep in: abuse. There's a sound that echoes louder than a crowded cafeteria, louder than television static or hallway chatter. It's the sound of a lonely heart, beating in a room full of people. In nursing homes across the world, there's a quiet epidemic nobody talks about: loneliness. Not the kind cured by bingo nights or group exercise, but the kind that seeps into your bones, and whispers, "You've been forgotten." Let me tell you about Alma. She's 91, used to be a piano teacher, lived in a house full of laughter, music, and grandchildren. Now, she sits by a window, every day, same sweater, same chair, staring out, as though waiting for something, or someone, that never comes. She eats with others, she hears footsteps, voices, TVs, alarms, but none of it reaches her, because being surrounded by people isn't the same as being seen. There's a cruelty to this kind of loneliness, not because it's loud, but because it's silent, not because you're abandoned, but because you slowly fade from everyone's priority. We used to call our elders for advice, now we schedule 5-minute calls out of guilt. We used to bring them soup, sit by their bed, hold their hand. Now we send texts we forget to follow up. Technology gave us speed, but it stole our presence. Studies now show that loneliness is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It weakens the immune system, raises the risk of dementia, speeds up death more than diabetes or obesity, yet we dismiss it as just part of getting old. No, it's not age that isolates people, it's society's choice to stop showing up. The tragedy isn't that elders are alone, it's that they're alone. After giving their lives to everyone else, they raised children, they paid mortgages, they served, built, cleaned, cooked, taught, healed, and now, they wait for visits that don't come, calls that go unanswered, and birthdays where the only celebration is a plastic cupcake and a rushed song. Loneliness in old age isn't just emptiness, it's grief for a life that feels like it's still going, but without an audience, without purpose, without witness. And here's the painful irony, many of these people are not forgotten out of cruelty, but out of distraction. We get busy, we think they'll be okay, we assume they don't need us as much, but they do, now more than ever. If you're watching this, and you have an aging parent, or neighbor, or friend, let this be a wake-up call. Sometimes, the greatest medicine isn't found in a pill bottle, it's found in showing up, a visit, a conversation, a simple moment of presence, because the cruelest thing isn't dying alone. It's living while feeling like you no longer matter, and yet. Loneliness is just one form of pain, there's another kind, the kind hidden under blankets, behind bruises, beneath silence, a form of suffering that many endure, but few dare to speak of. Not all dangers shout, some whisper, they hide in plain sight, behind polished floors, tidy bed sheets, and smiling staff photos on brochures, but behind closed doors in many nursing homes, there are silent threats that can steal your health, your dignity, even your life. This is not fearmongering, this is a wake-up call. Let me introduce you to George, 78, former firefighter. Strong, stoic, survived 2 house fires in his lifetime, but what nearly took him down, a bedsore, it started as a red patch, unnoticed. Unmentioned, 2 weeks later, infected, by the time his daughter visited, it had turned into a wound the size of a fist, all because no one helped him shift positions in bed. Because staff were overworked, and George didn't want to bother anyone, he didn't burn in a blaze, he slowly deteriorated. In a system meant to protect him, here's the truth, many nursing homes aren't equipped to prevent or detect slow-developing health threats like pressure ulcers, bed sores, aspiration pneumonia, urinary tract infections left untreated, medication errors, undiagnosed dehydration or malnutrition. These aren't freak incidents, they're systemic failures caused by understaffing, poor oversight, and residents who are too afraid or too ashamed to speak up, and because symptoms don't always scream. They're brushed off as just old age. But here's a sobering truth. Old age doesn't equal inevitable suffering. We've normalized decline so much that we fail to question why it's happening. If a child had a fever, we'd panic. We'd act, but when a 90-year-old becomes confused, dehydrated, or weak, we shrug. It's part of getting old. It's not, it's neglect masquerading as acceptance, studies show. Up to 80% of nursing home residents are at risk of medication mismanagement. 1 in 3 nursing home residents experience preventable harm. Dehydration and malnutrition go unnoticed in nearly half of all residents, not because the staff are evil, but because the system is broken. 1 nurse for 20 patients, 5 minutes per person, no time to notice when someone stops eating, no space to ask, "Are you in pain?" And what hurts the most, it's not the infection, not the bruises, not the falls, it's the feeling that nobody is watching, that no one will notice until it's too late, that you could be fading, and the world would keep spinning, untouched. This is the real sickness in many nursing homes. Not just physical ailments, but the dangerous idea that elders don't matter enough to be monitored, cared for, or protected. So what can you do? If you have a loved one in a nursing home, don't just check in, inspect. Ask questions. Document. Be present, look for these red flags. Are bed linens often soiled or unchanged? Are medications clearly labeled and accounted for? Do they seem weaker, confused, or emotionally flat all of a sudden? Are the staff rushing conversations, or do they know your parent by name? And if you're a senior yourself, never stop speaking up. Your body may grow old, but your voice should grow stronger. Remember, dignity in old age is not a luxury. It's not earned by medals, pensions, or perfect pasts. It's your birthright, a right to be cared for, to be watched over with compassion, to not simply exist, but to be valued, until your very last breath. But even if all these health risks were managed, there's one thing that no nurse, no medicine, no system can protect against, and that's the loss of hope, of meaning, of soul. You've worked your whole life, you saved, sacrificed, paid your dues, and now, finally, you're retired. You should feel safe, right? But let me ask you something. Do you really know who is managing your money now? And more importantly, do you still own your financial life, or has it quietly been signed away? Behind closed doors, meet Lillian. She was 82 when she moved into a nursing home, widowed. No kids. But sharp as a tack, she had a modest savings account, a pension, and a home she'd spent 40 years paying off. A month after moving in, she received a letter. Her house had been sold. She was shocked. She didn't remember signing anything, but in the fine print of her admission forms, buried between medical waivers and emergency contacts, was a clause: power of attorney granted to facility legal representative in case of cognitive decline. Nobody told her. Nobody explained. Now the money she thought would carry her through her final years was being used to pay $7,000 a month to keep her in a small room, with a broken heater and stale food. She didn't just lose her home, she lost her control. Let's be brutally honest. Money is the quiet engine behind many nursing homes, and when an elderly person is perceived as alone, confused, or vulnerable, they often become a target, not just a patient. Here's what really happens: hidden fees tucked into care plans, unnecessary treatments billed to Medicaid or Medicare, residents pressured into signing over bank access for convenience, family members using elder signatures to gain power of attorney, without their full understanding, monthly rates that creep higher, while service quality drops lower, and all of it is legal. Why? Because the elderly are seen as easy to overlook. Think about this. You can spend decades building a life, a reputation, a future, only to have it quietly dismantled by a printer, a signature, and a system that profits from your silence. That's the most dangerous part, not the loss of money, but the loss of ownership of choice, of control, of voice. In many homes, once your money is handled by someone else, you stop being the captain of your own ship. You're now just a passenger, drifting wherever the tide takes you. Let the numbers speak. The National Council on Aging estimates that financial elder abuse costs seniors over $36 billion a year. Only 1 in 44 cases of financial abuse is ever reported. Nursing home residents with no close family are 3 times more likely to be exploited financially. In some states, court-appointed guardians have full control over financial decisions, even if the senior disagrees, and once it starts, it's hard to stop. But what hurts most isn't the money, it's the betrayal. Imagine waking up one day to find your bank account drained, your car sold, your belongings thrown away, and being told, "Don't worry, it's for your own good." It's not just financial abuse, it's soul theft. You feel small, useless, powerless, and worst of all, forgotten, because in a world that equates old age with incompetence, you're no longer asked, you're just told. But you are not helpless. Here's what you must do, whether you're 60, 70, or 90. Review every document before signing. Don't let urgency force you into silence. Appoint a trusted financial advocate, not just a relative by default. Use third-party financial monitoring tools that alert you to unusual transactions. Demand full transparency from the nursing home. Ask for itemized bills, monthly breakdowns, care receipts. Consult an elder law attorney before giving away power of attorney. It is not a simple formality. And most importantly, ask questions. The moment you stop asking is the moment others start deciding for you. In the end, managing your money in old age isn't about wealth, it's about will. It's about keeping your dignity intact, even when your body is slowing down, even when the world seems to move faster than you. Because every signature is a story, and every dollar represents a decision, a memory, a legacy. Don't let yours be rewritten by someone else's hand. You've heard the stories, the shadows lurking behind nursing home walls, the loneliness that echoes through empty rooms, the silent theft of money, identity, and dignity. But now, it's time to take a deep breath, to look beyond those walls, both physical and invisible, and remember who you truly are, because your power was never locked away. It has always been inside you, waiting, ready, waiting for you to reclaim it. Let me tell you about James. At 78, James was admitted to a nursing home after a stroke. He felt lost, forgotten by family, overwhelmed by the new routine. But James made a choice. He refused to be a passive passenger. he started small, asking questions. Learning about his care plan, reaching out to other residents. Slowly, he regained control. He formed a circle of support, friends, advocates, even a legal advisor. Within months, James was managing his finances again. He attended community meetings and even helped improve the facility's food quality. He proved one thing, that power isn't about youth or health, it's about the will to stand up and be seen. Power, dear listener, is not given, it is reclaimed, not inherited, but remembered. It is not the size of your body or bank account, it is the size of your voice and the courage to use it. Every breath you take is an act of resistance, every choice you make, no matter how small, is a statement of your humanity. This is the ultimate truth of aging. You are not less, you are different, yes, but your spirit is no weaker. So, how do you break free? How do you rise beyond those walls and take back what is yours? Here are the 6 silent powers every elder must awaken. 1. The power of awareness. Know your rights, understand your care, and never let information be withheld. 2. The power of connection. Build relationships, inside the home and out. Isolation is the enemy. 3. The power of advocacy. Find allies, family, lawyers, social workers. You don't have to fight alone. 4. The power of voice. Speak up. Share your story. Your voice can change policies, perceptions, and lives. 5. The power of self-care. Honor your body and mind. Nutrition, exercise, and mental stimulation are acts of rebellion against decline. 6. The power of legacy. Remember, your life story is a gift. Share it. Teach it. Empower the next generation. This is your moment. Your story is still unfolding. You are more than a resident, more than a patient, more than a number on a ledger. You are a warrior of time, a keeper of wisdom, a beacon for those who come after. Don't let walls, brick or invisible, define you. Rise, reclaim, reignite the fire within, because the greatest freedom isn't just surviving, it's thriving. As you listen to this, take a moment, breathe deeply, look around, at your hands, your heart, your mind, feel the power already there, and when you're ready, step beyond those walls, not alone, but armed with wisdom, armed with love, armed with your own unbreakable spirit. The journey beyond the walls starts now. Thank you for joining this journey. Remember, your life is your masterpiece. Protect it. Cherish it. Live it boldly. Until next time.